Hi, everybody. I am Larissa, and today I'm going to be talking about a particular strategy or approach that we use, which is utilising the cycle of adolescent violence in the home. Before I kind of introduce the cycle of adolescent violence, I do want to put it in context because it starts with our definition of AVITH, and specifically it is that parents adjust their own behaviour, and it's that element of adjustment in the relationship where things get stuck. So we have a violent behaviour and then we have the reaction to the violence. So AVITH doesn't happen in isolation. Therefore, tracking predictable sequences and interactions, how family members have learnt to react to one another, is a key intervention. And it's also really empowering because from the very beginning, it gets people out of kind of the story or the content of all the terrible things that have happened to begin to focus a little bit more on the process, which really helps people be less reactive and to have more options. And I do think that tracking dynamics is also the secret to calming. And in doing so, you gain a lot more clarity regarding the behaviour, which often from a parent's perspective is bewildering and confusing. It also helps understand the motivation behind the behaviour. We often are saying that a young person's use of violence, there's always a reason why it is happening, and finding that out is really important. Also, if we're wanting to hold in mind a large population of young people we're seeing are neurodivergent, we also have to hold in mind that we do need to make a distinction between controlling behaviours and the importance of controlling the environment to support their needs. And this really helps find that grey line between abusive behaviours and also meeting the needs of a neurodivergent young person. This is a summary of our cycle of adolescent violence. It is a key strategy and guide, and it really helps. In the first instance, we're often working with parents, so it really helps parents slow down interactions with their young person and begin to do something different. We do use it predominantly with parents, but we can also use it with the young person using violence if they're well engaged and willing and able to talk about what's happening at home. But we also use it with siblings in supporting them to prioritise their safety as well. With a lot of what I'll be talking about today, we'll kind of mostly focus on the perspective of working with parents. So our focus is always about safety. Safety is our first principle. And underneath the cycle of violence, we're also incorporating a lot of other principles and strategies that really inform the work. I kind of think that this approach really creates a scaffolding around everything that we do. A lot of parents will often be saying that violence seems to come out of nowhere, that their young person goes from 0 to 200 in under 20 seconds. And so by beginning to observe what is happening at home, it really helps to identify often very predictable and known and repetitive patterns rather than just an emotional reaction to trying to stop the young person's bad behaviour. So we ask parents to begin to look at their own reactions and interactions to begin to prioritise safety and to really recognise the early warning signs that things might be escalating. A core strategy that we have is that we recognise that timing is crucial. Thus, the clock face, which helps parents plan and assist their young person to not escalate into violence. And a lot of the responses are often quite counterintuitive. I'm often saying to parents that common sense parenting often doesn't work when you've got a young person that chooses violence. And using the cycle of adolescent violence really helps parents identify those important times of backing off and times of repair. We've divided the clock under 4 core sections. So the 12 to 3 o'clock, we call the build-up phase. And this is where there might be some ability to divert or U-turn the tension. The 3 to 6 o'clock mark is around prioritising safety. So the aim here is to stop talking and to back off, and to really recognise that the young person is in fight, flight, freeze. So there's no teaching opportunity and no parenting opportunity in this moment because nobody's listening. The 6 to 9 o'clock period is a space of recovery. It's around focusing on self-care and self-soothing for everybody. And the 9 till 12 o'clock per section is around prioritising repair. And really recognising that in adolescent violence, there's rarely an apology. Therefore, parents often end up having to initiate reconnection. And this is where setting expectations, if it's safe to do so, might be possible. So going a little bit deeper around these different phases, if we're focusing on the build-up phase, 12 till 3 o'clock, this is where we're encouraging family members to identify their own feelings of apprehension or anxiety, which often can alert them to rising tension in their young person. And as early as possible, around that 12 or 1 o'clock mark, we're encouraging empathic listening or listening for feelings, which might help calm and divert potentially negative interactions. And it also can be an opportunity to help the young person feel safer and more open to talk through their problems rather than act them out. And if we're thinking around this particular phase where we have a young person who's neurodivergent, then it's really helping parents recognise that their parenting needs to look really different, to view their young person's behaviour often as connection seeking as opposed to attention seeking. And it really is to help parents understand and recognise their young person's level of need. So for example, there's likely to be a huge amount of anxiety and maybe a high need for control. And how do we help parents understand their young person's individual capacities and to really adjust their expectations? So for example, trying to get your young person going to school every day just might not be realistic in the here and now. And I think it also is around a parent's expectations can often be experienced by their young person as a demand, and that demand might actually be quite triggering. So part of the work here might be to focus more on tracking regulation, tracking triggers, and learning to manage. And I think also this is where other supports around a young person who's neurodivergent becomes really, really important. So those elements of medication, behavioural specialists, OTs, etc., etc. When it comes to particular ways in which we map out what this phase might look like, some of the key things that we might be looking for or asking about might be what was happening earlier in the day for this young person. What might be really predictable that we know. Sometimes Monday mornings are the worst for anxiety and distress, for example. How did an interaction with the young person start? What were you or the young person wanting or asking? What did you notice in yourself? And what might be some of the really early warning signs in yourself or your young person of tension rising? And if you're noticing that, what might be some things that you might be able to do to calm yourself? And if we consider a young person who's neurodivergent, then it might be about asking some additional questions around what might be driving their dysregulation. Is it frustration? Is it defiance, or is it just resistance towards an authority figure? And is this dysregulation only occurring when the young person is stressed and frustrated, the reactive? Or is it pervasive, no matter whether the young person is stressed or not? When we're looking at safety planning in the 3 to 6 o'clock mark, it's really recognising it's the first response to a question or a reasonable request that is your warning sign. So it's often the first swear word. And that's then recognizing you are at 3 o'clock and it's no longer a time for talking, resolving issues, or getting into debates, negotiations, or setting consequences. And it is really recognizing that you and the young person are likely to be in fight, flight, freeze. So it really is around the importance of stopping then and there and really prioritizing safety, which usually means backing off, disengaging, or walking away. And parents will often find backing off extremely challenging because they'll believe that the young person is then winning. So by backing off, it's like telling the young person that they have permission to continue to behave in certain ways without consequence. I'm often encouraging parents to think that 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock is not a teaching moment. And often parents' attempts to try to parent or teach is what fuels and escalates the violence. And all the young person really learns is to further blame their parents for making them escalate into violence and not take responsibility. A really, really good example where World War III can escalate really quickly is when a parent might be asking their young person late at night to get off the computer and might remind them 3 or 4 or 5 times while ignoring their own level of frustration and anger, only to find themselves half an hour later marching into that room, pulling the computer, off the table and disconnecting the modem. And often that will result in a really significant escalation of physical abuse or property damage. So it's really around recognizing that parents can become really dysregulated, and actually all the young person will remember is the injustice, not the teaching moment. If we're thinking about this phase, safety phase, and a neurodivergent young person, I think it really is around recognizing that you might have a young person that has more triggers, greater reactivity, and limited capacity to come back into regulation. So how do you support a young person's capacity to tolerate stresses and move more quickly into regulation when an escalation is occurring? And I hear in speaking with a lot of young people that are neurodivergent, they'll often say that they're trying really hard to do better, but they continue to react and overreact despite their best intentions. And I think it also is around holding a whole lot of empathy and understanding for the young person's challenges and difficulties and just what they're trying to learn. And to recognise that defiance, for example, is often about a defence and is benevolent rather than manipulative. And if I think around a PDA profile, for example, it's a highly sensitive nervous system to threat, and demands are often perceived as a threat. So these are just things that can be really helpful around holding empathy and understanding. Some of the key questions that we might be asking is, what's the safest way to back off? And are you as a parent, for example, backing off early enough? What might be some helpful prompts to help notice timing, to remind yourself, or if you're co-parenting well, that your partner might be able to say, hey, we're at 3 o'clock, we need to back off. What might be some of the things that you're feeling or thinking? What are you saying to yourself? So parents will often have a lot of strong beliefs and a lot of shoulds that determine what they do next. You know, what might be some of the things that make it really difficult to back off or to stop talking? And here are some just lovely quotes from parents about what really made a difference and increased safety in the home. That often it's just one small thing, but actually can make a huge difference. You know, so a parent being able to say, I notice we are getting upset, and says to their young person, let's take a break. Or I know I can follow up later and I don't need to deal with everything in this moment. Or be able to recognise and allow the young person to have some natural consequences rather than having to set them. You know, so for example, getting out of the win-lose battle of trying to get a young person off a gaming device or off their computer. Some of the natural consequences might be that they're really tired and struggling to get out of bed the next morning, and parents handing that responsibility to their young person rather than getting into those battles. And a simple reminder of I just have to notice to not take things personally. So when we're looking at the 6 to 9 o'clock mark, this is a place of self-care and recovery. And parents often are not recognising that it takes time for their young person to calm down. And parents, for example, maybe don't need to start interacting with their young person 10 minutes after an escalation, but often at minimum, they're going to need to leave a good hour before their young person might actually be more in their frontal lobes. And it is around also helping parents recognise just how isolated, exhausted and depressed they might feel, and actually how do they attend to themselves first. And also there can be siblings, and often are, that are impacted by the violence in the home and might also need their parents' attention. And most of the parents that we see that have been struggling for a long time often have really ignored having any time for themselves. And I think one of the things that really get in the way of parents looking after themselves is a whole lot of resentment that really can fuel a lot of punitive responses, or parents trying too quickly to set a consequence and hold the belief that the young person will only change because the consequence is significant or hurtful enough to them. And so really being able to name and recognise a parent's own anger that can also fuel punitive responses is a big part of the process, because we know that a lot of parents have, in their attempts to manage and control the violence in the home, have also used levels of force, for example. So some of the key questions that we might ask are, what self-care is needed, helpful, or you might be avoiding? What were you wanting to do but couldn't? What were you feeling at this point? And how can you reduce your anger, your isolation, or your resentment? Or how do you recognise just how triggered or potentially dissociated you are because the event has taken you back and has reminded you of other events that have been frightening and overwhelming? And often it also is a good phase to kind of go what worked and what didn't work. So there's time for parents to actually just digest things and to let it go. If we're looking at parenting a young person who's neurodivergent, then I think it really is around that you might have a young person that doesn't easily understand the impact of their escalation on others. That we might also have a young person that is feeling deeply shamed after an escalation and might be seeking comfort and reassurance. They may not remember how they have behaved. And it often will represent the young person's level of dysregulation and their inability to cope with a stressor. And that often a parent will have to sit with a lot of grief, sadness, and loss. And I think often a lot of young people I've spoken to kind of say that they really fear their anger, and they just are beside themselves in trying to figure out how to manage it. And often that fear really keeps them stuck. And often that ability to take some perspective, that a young person often can't see themselves as a good person in a bad situation. And so that level of shame, often can be really devastating. And a young person can get stuck in that sense of, I am bad, and I am unloved. When we're looking at the 9 to 12 o'clock phase, this is a time to invest in relationship repair, as the young person typically is unlikely to say sorry. So rather than parents looking for or demanding an apology, it's parents that need to initiate repair, and to look for signs that a young person might be ready to engage. And sometimes, that is when a young person asks for something. I have many examples of parents often kind of saying, I really think that my kid's bipolar or manipulative or, lacking in empathy, because 1 minute they're raging and then 10, 15, 20 minutes later, they're asking, Mum, can you take me to McDonald's? And we really reframe that as this is a young person's attempt to reconnect. And they're kind of testing out that sense, are we okay? And also will come with the, let's not talk about just what happened. I don't want to think about it, can't really remember it, but can we just now get on, and are we okay? That being said, however, I think that parents need to initiate those small acts of relationship repair that help reduce the isolation and disconnection that often becomes such a predominant pattern within family relationships. So it might just be around inviting the young person to do something, like, hey, I'm going for a walk, do you come with me? Or, I'm going to go visit a friend, do you want to come? Or I'm going to the shops, I can take you there. Or it might just be a small gesture of goodwill, just I'm making a cup of tea, would you like one? It might be that all that you can do is text a good night message to your kid, because a face-to-face interaction might still be too tenuous. And to really remember that if a young person is asking you a question or a favour, the best thing to do is to stop and to listen. So one of the things to consider if you have a young person who's neurodivergent is around, when might it be a good time to connect with your young person, and how much connection can be tolerated, and when is it enough? And how can your young person come back to regulation and self-soothe? And how, most importantly, can the parent provide reassurance that their young person is loved for who they are, and not to just focus on their challenging behaviours. And I think it is around remembering that parents need to be really, really authentic, because their young person will be hyper attuned to their parents' nervous system, body language, facial expressions, and tone of voice, and will most likely misread it as the parent being more angry and critical than they might actually be. Some of the core questions that we ask when we're mapping out this phase is around how can you as a parent extend the olive branch, and how might you as a parent be ready yourself for repair, and what might be just one small thing that you can do to initiate a positive connection. And it might just be just time together without talking. Is there an opportunity to do something different? You know, what can you try, experiment with? And I think all of those become really important. And I think that if you've got a neurodivergent young person, you know, it might also be around managing those opportunities for autonomy and giving a whole lot of choice. So it might be a lot of permission seeking from a parent. Is now a good time to have a conversation? Or a lot of those I wonder comments, and kind of sharing an intention of an interaction to be able to openly say, we can spend some time, quiet time together. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. Some of the common barriers that we see that can get in the way of attunement is a parent rushing to fix things or to give advice, that a parent is trying to manage the situation rather than sitting with their experience, the reacting to an injustice of their young person's behaviour. A parent can often feel really overwhelmed and highly distressed and overwhelmed with emotions. Parents can just be too busy or don't have enough time. If there's been multi-generational abuse and trauma, then the young person might remind the parent of their past experiences of abuse or partner violence. A lot of parents are just in survival and making ends meet, and will be exhausted and might not have more to give. There can be a huge amount of guilt, and sometimes attempts to try to make amends. And a lot of parents just are hoping that love will stop the violence. And, you know, sometimes just the best thing that a parent can do is to extend their hand to their young person and just say, I know, as a beginning point of beginning to just sit with the experience. And if we ask what young people want from their parents, what they often are saying is just somebody to talk to listen, to understand, to not shout at them, to not criticize them, to not tell them I told you so, to just have quality time together, but also to have space to grow and experiment, and space to calm down. And sometimes they need other people that can mediate things, that are confidants, or a professional that might be able to heal their past trauma. And mostly what we're encouraging or trying to build is to help parents give their young person a message that we accept you for who you are, that we as parents can cope and can remain calm under pressure, that we will not enter into win-lose battles with you. We are wanting win-win outcomes, that we trust that you can make good decisions. We believe that you know how to keep yourself safe. And we are confident you will ask for help and trust that you get into trouble. You know that we are there for you and will support you and will back you up. And that experiencing mistakes and failures are a normal part of life and never an end point. And there is always room for making amends and forgiveness. That is it. And if anybody ever wants to contact us, this is our email. Thanks very much.